Good morning. It's Tony. Just wanted to talk to you all about another book. This time, a book that's actually on the list that I put out of my top recommendation for historical books. So this book was published in 1916, and it's called The Autobiography of Bishop Isaac Lane. Very good book. So it was initially published in 1916. Of course, this is just a reprint that I was able to purchase. So Robert Lane, Isaac Lane, was actually the fifth bishop of the CME Church, being elected before my great great uncle Robert Williams, who was the sixth bishop, and he lived to be 103. He was actually born in 1834, and he died in 1937. So this book is really interesting. It gives a lot of good perspectives of the issues of the time, but also the CME Church. So I definitely would recommend that you get a chance to read it, just to put a lot of things in perspective. Because when it comes to history, of course you can learn what you learn in school, but it's always good to have other writings where you can kind of look at who wrote it, what their situation was at that time in society, just to get new perspectives. So of course, with Bishop Lane, he did come from a mixed ancestry. From what the research shows, either his father or grandfather was white. I believe his father. And he did play a role in his education as well, which opened doors for him, obviously, throughout his life. Um, the Some of the things that the book cover, I think, are pretty that stuck out to me. I'll share with you. So one thing he discusses is basically the Emancipation Proclamation. So obviously he lived through that, being that he was born pre-Civil War, and of course he died well into the 1930s. And one thing he mentions is that when they first received work, when the Emancipation was first put out in his autobiography, he mentions how there was a big effort in the South to not let that be known, because they wanted to preserve their institutions. That was his perception of what he saw as he lived through it. And that's kind of an interesting point, being that we just celebrated Juneteenth yesterday, which again is a holiday that kind of recognizes the fact that, yes, the emancipation was signed, but it still took another like 2 years before all slaves were actually freed and notified that they were freed. So it's kind of interesting to see Bishop Lane actually mentions that as something he saw playing out in his life. And the cool thing about this book too is, of course, it talks about the founding of the church. So one thing the CME Church really prides itself with is what I would say is an unbroken ordination system, meaning a laying on of hands from priest to priest to priest, bishop, all the way back to the founder, which was John Wesley. So in the early parts of the church, it describes how basically when it was time, once African Americans were free, of course, they wanted to still practice their faith, but they didn't want to be second-class citizens within the church. So it was members of the Christian Methodist Episcopal South Church, which was basically the Methodist white churches. They actually assisted the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, which at that time was known as the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, and actually setting up their conferences and becoming, a legitimate religious organization pattern off of the appropriate, doctrine and the way they're supposed to operate. So it was kind of neat to see that. So, most people think of this time as just segregated time, but there were a lot of unity in different aspects. So these priests and bishops actually helped the early bishops, and was part of their original ordinations to make sure that when they were ordained, it was, legitimate, and they followed that same unbroken lineage. So Bishop Miles, I believe it is, and Bishop Beebe, the first and second bishops of the CME Church, were actually ordained by white CME preachers who also trace Methodist preachers who also trace their lineage back to John Wesley and the origin of the church. So that's kind of interesting to see. And of course, Bishop Lane also talks about the early expansion of the church and its strides in education. So you see the building and establishment of Lane College, as well as Miles College, Payne's College, all these different institutions. And he do touch on some of these as far as when they were established, how they were established, and of course the benefit it brought to the African American race as people were trying to become more educated with their newfound freedom. Because he also talks about that when they were first freed, it was really hard. You know, a lot of African Americans were uneducated, they had no money, so this newfound freedom was, you know, worthy of celebration. But it was a very difficult time as African Americans had to find their way, you know, and they didn't have much to do it with. So, so those are some of the highlights. Of course, when Bishop Lane, when his wife died, he also included some telegraphs from some of the different dignitaries and other clergy that sent their condolences. So one of them I'll read is actually from my great uncle, and it says, "Dear Bishop Lane, your telegraph of the death of your dear wife brought sorrow to our hearts and sadness to our home. It was the mysterious providence of God in taking her so suddenly from you. You have my prayers. May God bless you and your family. Bishop R.S. Williams, Washington, North Carolina." So that was a telegraph that my great uncle sent to him at the passing of his first wife, because he ended up being married twice. Um, Again, it goes through and it gives a lot of information on some of the founding bishops as well. So that's pretty neat too. So for people who are into that, which I am, so that if you were to get a copy of this book, you would see their photos and a lot of their biographical information. And of course, I share with you my own great uncle in his youth is also pictured in the book. And of course, it you know, talks about you know, his upbringing, his life, and of course a lot of the contributions he made to the church. You know, being on the board of trustees of Payne College at one point, the board of trustees at Miles College at one point, before becoming the senior bishop of the church. So again, anyone who's interested into, you know, whether it's Black history, African American religious history, or specifically Methodism, or the establishment of the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, I would definitely recommend this book. Again, produced in 1916, the Autobiography of Bishop, you know, Isaac Lane. He was the fifth bishop of the CME Church, lived to be 103. So definitely a very, you know, good perspective to get as you know, go to school and learn history, or whether it's Black History Month or Juneteenth or any kind of holiday where you're kind of thinking of race relations in our past, or the, you know, just Reconstruction and the, you know, African American struggle and going from slavery to prosperity. You know, and another thing is you think about it, you look at things like Tulsa. I mean, he was alive when it happened, so to, you know, you'd have to, it kind of puts into perspective. You know, he was born a slave. You know, he lived through the Civil War, became free, was able to help start a denomination, and go all the way up to become the bishop of that. At one point, he was the senior bishop of the denomination, and then to see African Americans, you know, build colleges, attain knowledge and education to a point where they could build Tulsa, which was known by a lot of people as Black Wall Street or the Black Mecca. And of course, he ended up seeing that destroyed in one night, basically, as the, you know, history shows. I mean, it only took about from like a Friday to a Friday night, Saturday morning or something, where over, you know, 30 square like city blocks of, you know, churches, hospitals, theaters, schools, businesses, just homes, just all destroyed. You know, several hundred African Americans killed and imprisoned. You know, and this was something he would have lived through, to see slavery abolished, the big rise in Reconstruction, where you see some of the first African American leaders at the national level, and then to see that all starting to go back as Jim Crow laws take us back, and these big type of you know, massacres and acts of terrorism were occurring all over the nation. You know, so definitely an interesting figure. So with that, you know, I hope you all have a blessed Saturday. I just wanted to share that with you. So I'll try to, you know, do a few videos to go over all the books on my list, because again, every one of those books I've read on the list that I posted, and a bit of them I have the original prints or some reprints, and the ones I don't have, of course, I read them online. But I think it's just worth sharing some of those, just to encourage people to get back into history. So stay safe and feel free to drop a comment, and see you soon.